I am going to begin this one at the top of a great staircase, on a glittering night in the spring of 1819. At the precise moment, a pair of double doors swung open, and 400 of the most fashionable people in England turned to look, because what they saw in that doorway stopped the whole bright roaring ball, as though someone had reached out and pinched the flame of it between two fingers. It was the Wyndham Ball. If you moved at all in society in those years, you knew the Wyndham Ball, the great annual gathering at Wyndham Court, the most coveted invitation of the season, the night on which the whole glittering world crammed itself into one set of staterooms to see and be seen. And on this particular night, the ballroom was at its fullest and its loudest and its most brilliant, the candles blazing in their hundreds, the music soaring away, 400 people in silk and diamonds packed beneath the painted ceiling. When the doors at the top of the stair opened, and the master of the house appeared to make his entrance, and on his arm was a woman. And the ball stopped. It did not stop all at once. It stopped the way a wave breaks, beginning at the foot of the stair, where the nearest guests looked up and froze, and rippling outward across the great room, conversation guttering and dying in widening circles, until even the musicians in the gallery faltered, and the last note died with a small, undignified squawk, and 400 people stood in a silence you could have heard a pin drop into, every face turned up to the doorway, every face wearing the same expression, which was the open, undisguised, thunderstruck shock of people who cannot believe what they are seeing. For they knew her. That was the thing. Across 10 years, across the change that 10 hard years works on a face, the older among them knew her at once, and the knowing went round that room like a cold wind, name passed to name in horrified whispers. Is that? Surely it cannot be. It is her, the Lowell girl, until somewhere near the front, a woman's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble, and no one even looked round at the sound, because no one could look away from the doorway. A woman near 30, in a gown of deep midnight blue, with dark hair and a pale, composed face, and a stillness about her that was somehow louder than any noise in that room, standing at the top of the staircase, perfectly calm, looking down at the 400 upturned faces of the people who had, in that very room, 10 years before, destroyed her. And on her arm, presenting her to the room as the honored lady of his house, stood the Earl of Wyndham, the host, the master of the ball. And I am going to stop us right there. Right there, with the whole glittering ball frozen at the foot of the stair, and the shattered glass on the marble, and Cecilia Lowell looking down at the room that ruined her on the arm of the man who owned it. Because before I tell you who she was, and what was done to her in that room 10 years ago, and how in heaven's name she came to be standing there now on the arm of its host, you and I have our arrangement. Find the subscribe button and press it. It is free, and it takes a moment, and it means the next story finds you the instant I have it ready, and there is always a next, and they are always worth the having. And if you will not, then you owe me one, and I am very patient about my debts, and I never, ever forget. This is a story about a woman who waited 10 years to walk back through one particular door, so you will appreciate that I understand a thing or two about patience, and about debts coming due. Now, before I let her take one step down that staircase, and oh, the steps she is about to take, every one of them a decade in the making, I must take you back, 10 years back, to this same room, on a night that began as the happiest of a young girl's life and ended as the worst. Come back with me. You cannot understand the triumph until you have wept through the ruin. She was 19 years old, the first time Cecilia Lowell walked into the Wyndham Ball, and she walked in on a tide of pure joy, with no more idea of what was about to happen to her than a lamb has of the butcher. She was nobody in the world's terms, and you must understand that, because it is the soil the whole cruelty grew in. The daughter of a country clergyman of good family, and no money, poor as such families are poor, gently raised on books and principle and not much else. She had come to London under the wing of a distant, grander cousin, a kind but careless woman named Mrs. Selby, who had a vague notion of doing the pretty by her poor relation and getting the girl a season. And the great prize of that season, the invitation Mrs. Selby had angled and schemed to secure, was a card to the Wyndham ball. And so Cecilia Lowell, 19 and penniless and lovely, came to the grandest gathering in England in a made-over gown, with her whole heart open and her whole future, she believed, beginning. And she was lovely. That too, you must understand, because beauty in a poor girl is not a gift. It is a danger. Cecilia Lowell was the kind of beautiful that turns a room, dark-haired, fine-eyed, with a warmth and a quickness and an unspoiled freshness about her that, in that jaded, fashionable crowd, shone like a lit window in a dark street. And when a poor nobody walks into a great ball and outshines every titled heiress in the room without the smallest effort or the smallest fortune, she makes herself, without ever meaning to, a target. For the fashionable world cannot abide being outshone by a nobody. It is the one thing it will not forgive. 2 men noticed her that night. Hold them both in your mind, for the whole of this story turns on the difference between them. The first was a young man named Mr. Crail, Gerald Crail, a fashionable blade of 25, handsome and idle and cruel in the careless way of men who have never once in their lives been told no. He was the leader of a certain set, the smart, hard, laughing young men who set the tone of a season and made and unmade reputations for sport. And he noticed Cecilia Lowell the way a cat notices a bird, with interest and with appetite, and with not one particle of kindness. He noticed, too, the way the room reacted to her, the way the great heiresses' noses went out of joint at this penniless girl drawing every eye, and he saw, with the quick instinct of his kind, an opportunity for exactly the sort of entertainment his set lived for. The second man who noticed her was a young man named Mr. Alexander Frain. And Mr. Alexander Frain was, that night, nearly as much a nobody as Cecilia herself, which is the great irony at the heart of this tale. He was a poor relation of the house, the nephew of the old Earl of Wyndham, the son of a younger brother who had died leaving nothing, taken in by the family out of duty, and kept very much in his place. He had no fortune and no prospects and no expectation whatever of the title, for the old Earl had a son, a healthy heir, and Alexander was merely the spare nephew, useful for making up numbers, a quiet, serious young man whom the fashionable set scarcely troubled to notice. He stood at the edge of his own uncle's ball, that night, very nearly as much an outsider as the clergyman's daughter, and perhaps that is why, of all the 400, he was the one who looked at Cecilia Lowell and saw, not a target, not a threat, not a nobody, but simply a girl, lovely, and a little overwhelmed, and shining with an honest joy that the whole hard room around her had long since lost. He asked her to dance. It was the bravest thing he had done in years, for he was shy, and she was the sensation of the evening, and he fully expected to be refused. She was not refused. They danced, once, twice, and they talked, in the breathless snatches a dance allows, and something kindled. Nothing was said, nothing could be said, in 2 dances, between 2 people who had just met. But Alexander Frain came off the floor after that second dance with his quiet heart going like a drum, certain that he had just met, in his uncle's crowded ballroom, the only person in it he would ever want to know better, and Cecilia Lowell went back to her cousin's side glowing, having found, in the grand, frightening, glittering room, one kind face, one true thing, one young man who had looked at her as though she were a person and not a prize. If the story had been allowed to go on from there, it would have been a very different and a much gentler tale, but it was not allowed to go on from there, because Gerald Crail had laid a wager. I am going to tell you what Crail did, plainly and without flinching, because the plainness of it is the horror, and because Cecilia carried the truth of it locked inside her for 10 silent years before she was given the chance to speak it aloud, and tonight, at last, I am going to speak it for her. It was a wager, a bet, laid among Crail's laughing set over their wine, Exactly the sort of thing that passed for sport among young men with too much money and no hearts. That Gerald Crail could take the little nobody who was making such a stir, the penniless parson's chit who thought rather too well of herself, and ruin her, publicly, before the night was out, for the entertainment of the company. Not seduce her, there was no time for that, nor any need. Merely ruin her, make her appear to be exactly the grasping wanton that the jealous room already half wished to believe she was, and watch the fashionable world do the rest. And Crail knew precisely how to do it, for it required only one cruel and simple trick. He wrote a note, a forged note, in a lady's hand, or near enough, made to look as though it came from Cecilia's own cousin, Mrs. Selby. The note was carried to Cecilia in the ballroom by a footman who had been slipped a coin, and it begged her, in Mrs. Selby's name, to come at once and quietly to the little blue saloon off the conservatory, away from the crowd, for her cousin was taken suddenly unwell and did not wish to make a scene. And Cecilia Lowell, 19, trusting, kind, with no more suspicion in her than a child, did exactly what any good-hearted girl would do. She slipped away from the ball, quietly, alone, and hurried through the conservatory to the little blue saloon to help her sick cousin. Her cousin was not there. Gerald Crail was there. And no sooner had she stepped into that room and realized her mistake, no sooner had Crail begun, smiling, to block the door, than the trap closed, exactly as designed. For Crail's friends had been waiting, and at the agreed moment they flung the saloon doors wide and raised the cry, loud enough to carry to the ballroom, summoning the company, and they brought a crowd of guests hurrying to the spot to discover Miss Cecilia Lowell, the penniless nobody, alone in a private room with a man, in the dark, away from the ball. And Crail played his part to perfection, stepped back with a great show of confusion, let his shirt be a little disordered, let his face wear exactly the look of a man caught out, and let the room draw, as the room was always going to draw, the only conclusion the staging permitted, that the grasping little parson's daughter had lured a fashionable gentleman into a private room to compromise him into marriage, and been caught at it. It was over in minutes. That is the thing about a ruin. It is built over weeks, and falls in an instant. The whisper went through the ball like fire. The Lowell girl, found alone with Crail, throwing herself at him, the brazen creature, and her with no fortune. Did you ever? Well, one always knew, and Cecilia stood in the middle of it, white and shaking, and trying to say the truth. There was a note. My cousin was ill. I was sent for, and no one, not one soul in that great room, would hear her. For Crail's set swore she had come of her own accord, and Mrs. Selby, terrified for her own reputation, disclaimed all knowledge of any note and all responsibility for her disgraceful cousin, and the jealous fashionable world, which had been longing all evening for a reason to tear down the nobody who outshone it, seized the reason with both hands and tore. And Cecilia Lowell was ruined, utterly, instantly, irrecoverably ruined, in the space of a quarter of an hour, in the Wyndham ballroom, on what had been the happiest night of her life, branded a wanton and a fortune hunter before 400 witnesses, cast out into the night in her made-over gown, to the sound of laughter, her name finished, her family disgraced, her whole opening future slammed shut in her face forever, for the sport of a wager and the price of a forged note. But I told you to hold two men in your mind, and I told you the story turns on the difference between them. So before I let her vanish into the dark, for vanish she did, and for 10 long years, I must tell you what Alexander Frain did, while the room was tearing her apart. He believed her. That is the first and the most important thing, and it is the seed from which everything good in this story finally grew. In a room of 400 people, all eagerly believing the worst, one young man took one look at the white, shaking, desperate girl, trying to tell the truth, the girl he had danced with not an hour before, whose honest joy he had seen with his own eyes, and knew, instantly and with absolute certainty, that it was a lie, that she was not that kind of girl, that something had been done to her, and he said so. He pushed forward through the crowd. Alexander Frayne, the poor nephew, the nobody, and he raised his voice, which he had hardly ever done in his life, and he declared to the room that this was wrong, that there had plainly been some trick, that Miss Lowell was not capable of what they accused her of, that he himself had been in her company that very evening, and would stake his honor she was innocent. And the room laughed at him. That is the bitter heart of it. He tried. He was the one and only person in all that company who stood up and tried, and it counted for nothing, because he was nobody. He was the poor relation, the spare nephew without a fortune or a name worth the having, and his word against Gerald Crales was the word of a mouse against a lion. Crales' set turned his defense into a joke. Oh ho, Frayne's smitten with the little adventuress himself, she's caught two of them tonight, and the laughter swallowed him, and his uncle the old Earl, mortified that his own nephew was making a scene at his ball, took him hard by the arm and ordered him to be silent and remember his place. And Alexander Frayne, 24 years old and powerless, and shaking with a rage and a helplessness he would remember to his dying day, was silenced. And by the time he had broken free and gone to find her, to do something, anything, Cecilia Lowell was already gone, out into the night, vanished. He tried to find her. After, he must have it told to his credit, for it is true, he tried. But a poor young man with no resources cannot find a girl who does not wish to be found. And Cecilia and her shame had melted away into the great indifferent country. And the trail went cold, and the season rolled on, and the world forgot her, as the world always forgets the ones it ruins, having no further use for them once the entertainment is over. But Alexander Frayne did not forget her. I want you to mark that, and carry it, because it is the engine of everything. He did not forget her. He carried the image of her, the joy of her in the dance, and then the white, desperate, truth-telling face that no one would hear. He carried it for 10 years, like a stone in his chest, like a debt unpaid. He never spoke of it, but he never let it go, and he never, in all the 10 years that followed, met a woman who could make him forget the parson's daughter he had danced with twice and failed to save. That is the man. Now let me tell you what became of them both, across the 10 long years between that ruin and the night the doors opened at the top of the stair. For Cecilia, the 10 years were a long, slow climb, up out of a pit, hand over hand, with no one to help her. She did not die of it, though I think there were dark days, early on, when she might have wished to, for a ruined woman in those years lost not merely her reputation, but very nearly her right to exist, cut off from every respectable door, a stain on her family, a creature with nowhere to go. Her poor father, the country parson, took her back. He never for one moment believed the lie, and his steadfast faith in his daughter was, she always said afterward, the one rope that held her over the abyss in the worst of it. But the disgrace followed her, even into that quiet parish, and his living suffered for it, and she carried the guilt of that too. And when he died, a few years on, Cecilia was alone again, and poorer than ever, and quite without protection, in a world that had decided what she was, and would not be argued out of it. So she did what such women do. She made herself a small, safe, invisible life, far from anyone who had ever heard her name. She changed nothing so dishonest as her name itself. She was too proud for that, and too stubborn. She would not skulk as though she were truly guilty, but she went where the name meant nothing, to a town in the far north of England, and she took a position as a teacher in a school for girls, and she taught reading and music and deportment to other people's daughters, and she built, year by patient year, a life, a narrow life, a quiet, careful, loveless life, with no balls in it, and no society, and no expectation of anything more, but an honest one, and her own, scraped together out of the wreckage by the strength of her own 2 hands, and she made her peace with it. She told herself, and very nearly believed, that she wanted nothing more than this safety, that the girl who had walked glowing into the Wyndham ball was dead and well rid of, that she asked only to be let alone, to teach her pupils and keep her small rooms, and never, ever again to walk into a grand room and be looked at. She had learned what being looked at cost. And Alexander Frayne, across those same 10 years, rose by a road he never asked for and never wanted. For the wheel turned, as it does. The old Earl of Wyndham's healthy heir, the cousin who had stood so securely between Alexander and the title, died. A fever, abroad, sudden and stupid, and then, a few years later, the old Earl himself died, and Alexander Frayne, the poor nephew, the spare, the nobody who had been told to remember his place, woke one morning to find himself the Earl of Wyndham, master of Wyndham Court, possessor of a great fortune, and a great name, and the great annual ball, the most powerful host in England. And the very first thing he did with all that new and undreamed-of power, before he had even grown used to being called my lord, was to begin, at last, to look for her. He had power now, you see. That was the thing that had been missing 10 years before, when he stood helpless in the ballroom and watched her ruined and could do nothing. He had been a nobody then, and his word had been worth nothing, and he had failed her. Now he was the Earl of Wyndham, and his word could move the world, and he turned the whole of that power, quietly and relentlessly, to two purposes that had become, over 10 years, the great unfinished business of his life: to find Cecilia Lowell, and to prove what had been done to her. The finding took the better part of a year. A ruined woman who has buried herself in a far northern town is not easily traced, and the trail was 10 years cold. But a determined earl with money and patience can find very nearly anyone, and at last his inquiries ran the quarry to ground. A Miss Lowell, a teacher at a girls' school in a northern town, who matched, in every particular, the girl he had never forgotten. And Alexander Frayne, Earl of Wyndham, dropped everything and went north himself, alone, to find her. And the proving that he pursued in parallel with a cold and patient thoroughness that tells you how deep the old wound went. He set himself to uncover the truth of that night, 10 years buried, and the truth, as such truths do, had begun to surface of its own accord, for the years are hard on a guilty set. Crail's old circle had scattered and soured, and Alexander, asking the right questions in the right places, with the weight of an earldom behind them, found at last a man who had been there, one of Crail's set on that night, a Mr. Hartop, now fallen on hard times and eaten by a conscience he had drowned in wine for 10 years, who, when an earl came asking, broke and confessed the whole of it, the wager, the forged note, the trap, all of it, and set his confession down in writing and signed it. And Cecilia, it would turn out, had kept the note itself, the forged note that had lured her, the one piece of paper that proved it was a trap, kept it for 10 years at the bottom of a box, the way one keeps the blade that wounded one, not knowing why, only that one cannot let it go. So that when the Earl of Wyndham finally stood, hat in hand and heart in his mouth, at the door of a small set of rooms in a northern town, and a woman of near 30 opened it, older, graver, the unspoiled girlish joy long gone, but the fine eyes and the proud stillness unmistakable, he came to her armed not only with a love he had carried 10 years, but with the means, at last, to undo the lie that had destroyed her. She did not, I should tell you, fall into his arms, far from it. For Cecilia Lowell, opening her door to find a strange grand gentleman who named himself the Earl of Wyndham, felt not joy but terror, and then, when he had reminded her gently that he was the young man who had danced with her and tried to defend her, 10 years gone, she felt something worse than terror, which was the reopening of a wound she had spent 10 years learning to live around. "Why have you come?" she asked him, white to the lips, in the doorway of her small, safe life. "Whatever it is, my lord, I want no part of it. I have made a life here, a quiet one. It is mine, and it is honest, and it took me 10 years to build out of what your world left of me. If you have come out of pity, I do not want it. If you have come out of guilt, I cannot ease it. And if you have come," her voice shook, "to look at the ruined woman, and see what became of her, then you have looked, and you may go." And Alexander Frayne, who had rehearsed 100 speeches on the road north and forgot every one of them in the face of her, did the only thing that could possibly have reached her, which was to tell her the plain truth. "I have come," he said, "because I have not been able to forget you for 10 years, and I am tired of trying. I was there that night, Miss Lowell. I danced with you. I saw the trick done, though I did not know then how it was worked, and I stood up in that room and said you were innocent, and they laughed at me and silenced me, because I was a nobody whose word was worth nothing, and I have carried the shame of having failed you every day of the 10 years since. I am not a nobody now. The title fell to me, by a road I never wanted, and the first use I have found for it, the only use I truly care about, is this. I have come to undo what was done to you. I can prove it, Cecilia. I have found the man who confessed the wager. I have his confession, signed, and with it, and with the truth, I can clear your name before the whole of the world that ruined you, if you will let me." He paused, and then he gave her the rest of it, the part that frightened him more than any duel. "And I have come because the girl I danced with 10 years ago is the only woman I have ever wished to spend my life beside, and I find that the ruined woman she became, who built an honest life out of the wreckage with her own 2 hands, is braver and finer and dearer to me than the girl ever was. I have not come out of pity or guilt. I have come because I love you, and I always have, since before I had any right to, and I would give the whole of the earldom to make it right." It did not win her at once. How could it? 10 years of being looked at as a ruined thing does not unlearn itself in an afternoon, and Cecilia Lowell was far too clear-eyed and far too proud to fall, grateful and weeping, into the arms of the first great man who offered to rescue her. She mistrusted it, mistrusted him, the rescue, the very idea that her old life could be handed back to her by a lord like a returned glove. She had made her peace with smallness and safety, and here was a man offering to tear the roof off it and march her back into the very world that had taught her what being looked at cost. But he was patient. Lord, he was patient. 10 years had taught him patience if they had taught him nothing else. And he did not press her, and he did not vanish, and he came back, through that whole long northern winter, not as a great earl condescending to a ruined teacher, but as a man courting a woman he respected, slowly, honestly, earning by inches the trust that her ruin had taught her never to give. He met her on her own ground. He listened more than he spoke. He let her be prickly and proud and afraid, and did not flinch from any of it, and stayed. And Cecilia Lowell, who had armored her heart in 10 years of careful smallness, found the armor, against all her will, beginning to give, for there is no defense in the world that holds out forever against a good man who simply, patiently, refuses to leave. She fell in love with him over that winter, the better way, the slow way, with her eyes wide open, the way a woman loves who knows exactly what trust costs, and gives it anyway. And when at last she let herself believe that his love was real, and not pity, and not a dream, when she let herself, for the first time in 10 years, hope, he asked her the one enormous thing he had been building toward all along, the thing that was the whole purpose of the proof he had gathered. He asked her to come back, to the Wyndham Ball, on his arm, to walk back through the very doors of the room that had ruined her, 10 years later, as the honored lady of his house, and to let him clear her name, there, in that room, before the same world that had torn it from her. And that, not the love, but the return, was the hardest thing Cecilia Lowell was ever asked to do. For she did not have to do it, understand that. He offered her another way. He would clear her name however she wished, quietly, by letter, through the right channels. She need never set foot in that room again. She could marry him and live at peace, and let the truth do its work, without ever facing the people who had laughed. He laid that gentler path before her honestly, and meant it. And Cecilia Lowell thought about it for a long time, and then she chose the harder road, and she chose it for herself, and the reason she gave him is the reason I have brought you all this way to here. For 10 years, she said, that room has owned a piece of me. The girl I was died in it, and I have let her stay dead, because going back for her was more than I could bear. If you clear my name by letter, in the quiet, then the truth will be known, and I am grateful for it, more than I can say. But that room will still own her. I will have let them keep her, and I find, now, at last, with you beside me, that I am not willing to let them keep her one day longer. She lifted her chin, and there was the ghost of the girl in it, and the strength of the woman, both at once. I will go back, Alexander. I will walk through those doors on your arm, and I will stand in the middle of that room where they tore me apart, and I will take the truth into it myself, in my own voice, in front of every one of them, and I will walk out of it whole. Not because you saved me, because I went back and got her myself. That is the only ending I will have. Anything less, and they have still won. And that, my dear listeners, is the woman who stood at the top of the staircase as the doors opened and 400 faces turned to stone. Not a victim being paraded in triumph by a powerful man. A woman who had chosen, freely, with her eyes open, at the cost of every fear she owned, to walk back into the worst room of her life and reclaim what it had stolen. The Earl was on her arm, but she was the one who had decided to climb those stairs. So, now you know everything. Let me take you back to the top of that staircase and let her begin to come down. She came down the stairs slowly, on the Earl's arm, into the absolute silence, and 400 people watched her come. I have described the silence already. Let me describe what was in it. There was shock, of course, the raw disbelief that she should dare. But threaded through the shock, in the faces of the older guests, was something that the cleverer among them were already beginning to feel as fear. For they had been in this room 10 years ago. They had laughed. They had cut her. They had helped to tear her down. And here she was, returned, calm, magnificent, on the arm of the most powerful man in England, who was presenting her to them as the lady of his house. And the arithmetic of that was not lost on a single quick mind in the room. If the Earl of Wyndham vouched for Cecilia Lowell, if the Earl of Wyndham gave her his arm and his name and his house, then something was very wrong with the story they had all agreed upon 10 years ago, and a great many people in that room had a very great deal to lose if the truth of it should come out. And one man in that room had everything to lose. Sir Gerald Crail, for he was Sir Gerald now, having spent 10 years climbing comfortably on the foundation of his own and others' cruelties, a prosperous, established figure with a fashionable wife and a knighthood and a great deal to protect. Sir Gerald Crail stood near the front of the crowd and watched Cecilia Lowell come down the staircase, and the colour drained clean out of his face. For he, of all the 400, knew exactly what she could do to him. He knew the truth of that night, because he had built it. And he saw, in one cold instant, that the ruined nobody he had destroyed for a wager 10 years ago had come back with the power of an earldom behind her, and that if she chose to speak, she could pull the whole comfortable edifice of his life down on his head. So Gerald Crail did the only thing his kind ever know to do when they are cornered, which is to attack first. He had ruined her once by getting the room to believe a lie before she could speak the truth. He would do it again. And as Cecilia reached the foot of the stairs, into that ringing silence, Sir Gerald Crail stepped forward and pitched his voice to carry to every corner of the room, and he said, with a sneer dressed up as concern, the old practiced cruelty, "My Lord of Wyndham, I am sure you cannot know. You were scarcely more than a boy at the time, and these things are easily forgotten, but I feel it my duty to inform you, and the company, that the person you have brought among us tonight is no fit guest for any decent house. This is the Lowell girl, who disgraced herself in this very room 10 years ago, caught before all of us, throwing herself at a gentleman in a private room, a common little fortune hunter of the worst." "Yes," said Cecilia Lowell. She said it clearly, into the room, cutting straight across him, and the single calm word stopped him dead, because it was not the word he or anyone expected. The whole ball held its breath. "Yes," she said again, and she let go of the Earl's arm, and she stepped forward into the center of the room, into the very spot, very nearly, where she had stood white and shaking and unheard 10 years before. And this time she was not white, and she was not shaking, and this time, by God, they were going to hear her. I am the Lowell girl. I was ruined in this room 10 years ago, before all of you. A great many of you were here. I see your faces. I remember every one. You were told that I lured a gentleman into a private room to compromise him. You believed it. You laughed, and you cut me, and you cast me out, and you ruined my name, and broke my father's heart, and sent me out of this house into 10 years of exile. And not one of you, not one, would hear me when I tried to tell you the truth. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The silence carried it to every corner. So you will hear me now, because I have come back to tell it. And this time, I am not leaving until it is told. And she told it. The whole of it. The wager, laid over wine for sport. The forged note in her cousin's hand, summoning her to a sick relation who was never there. The trap sprung. The doors flung wide. The cry raised. The staging of it all by a man who had bet his friends he could destroy a nobody before the night was out. She told it plainly and completely, and the room listened in a silence you could have drowned in. And as she told it, every soul in that ballroom who had been there 10 years ago felt the ground shift under their feet. For it was, they realized with a slow, cold horror, entirely believable. It fit. It answered every strangeness of that night that none of them had ever troubled to question. You will say I have no proof, said Cecilia, that it is my word, the ruined woman's word, against his. She reached into her glove and drew out a paper, worn soft and yellow with 10 years keeping. I kept the note that summoned me. I have carried it 10 years, not knowing why. Here it is, in a hand got up to look like my cousin's, summoning me to that room. Compare it to Sir Gerald's own hand, if you doubt me. But you need not take only my word, nor only this. This is monstrous, Crail broke in, grey now, blustering. A pack of lies from a ruined creature trying to— It is the truth, said the Earl of Wyndham. And he stepped forward to stand beside her, the host, the master of the house, the most powerful man in the room, and the whole company turned to him, and he spoke into the silence with the full, cold weight of his name behind every word. I was in this room that night, he said. I danced with Miss Lowell an hour before she was ruined, and I saw with my own eyes a girl of honest joy and perfect innocence, and when the cry went up, I stood in this room and said it was a trick, and that she was guiltless, and I was a poor nephew then, a nobody, and you laughed me down and silenced me, and I have carried the shame of my failure for 10 years. He let that land. I am not a nobody now, and I have spent the past year, since this title fell to me, uncovering the truth of that night. I have here, and he drew out a second paper, the signed confession of Mr. Hartop, who was one of Sir Gerald Crail's own set on that night, and who has set down in his own hand the whole of the wager, the forged note, and the trap, exactly as Miss Lowell has described it. He has agreed to swear to it before any magistrate in England. He turned, slowly, and looked at Crail, and his voice went very quiet. You ruined an innocent girl for a wager, Crail, in my uncle's house, and you have prospered on it for 10 years. It ends tonight, in this room, in front of the same people who watched you do it. And the room turned. Oh, how the room turned. I have told you that the fashionable world is a crowd, and a crowd turns as one, and it turned now on Gerald Crail, with the same hungry speed it had once turned on Cecilia Lowell. For crowds do not love the truth, exactly, but they do love a victim, and Crail, exposed, blustering, grey-faced, guilty, made a far more satisfying one than the ruined girl had ever been. The whispers ran the other way now. The faces that had been horror-struck at Cecilia hardened against Crail. His fashionable friends edged away from him as though he carried plague. His wife went the colour of ash. And Sir Gerald Crail stood alone in the centre of the room, where he had destroyed an innocent girl for sport 10 years before, and was destroyed in his turn by the truth, before the whole of the world he had climbed so carefully, ruined, in the same room, on the same floor, by the same crowd, in a reversal so complete and so deserved that I have never in all my years of telling tales found a sweeter one to tell. He left that night. He left England before the season was out, in fact, for a man so publicly unmasked could not show his face in society again, and the doors that had opened so readily to the charming Mr. Crail slammed shut, one after another, on the disgraced Sir Gerald. And he went to live abroad, in a small way, on the far edge of things, which is a colder country than he had ever imagined, and he had a great deal of time, in it, to consider the girl he had ruined for a wager, and the night she came back. It is not the hanging he deserved, but it was the ruin he had dealt out, dealt back to him in full, in the very room he had dealt it, and I find, when I weigh it, that I am content. But the unmasking of the wicked, you will remember, is never the part I care most for. Let me tell you about the woman in the midnight blue gown. For when it was done, when Crail had fled, and the truth was out, and the whole room understood, at last and beyond any doubt, that Cecilia Lowell had been innocent all along, monstrously wronged, and had come back after 10 years to reclaim her own name with her own voice, the ball did a thing that balls do not often do, and that I do not think a single soul present ever forgot. It turned to her, and it bowed. Not all at once, and not in any organized way, but one by one, across that great room, the people who had ruined her 10 years before came to Cecilia Lowell, where she stood at the side of the Earl of Wyndham, and made their bows and their curtsies, some shamefaced, some weeping, some simply silent, and the music started again, hesitant and then full, and the lady of the house was, by the unspoken decree of the same crowd that had once cast her out, restored, more than restored. For there is no one the fashionable world will exalt more eagerly than the person it has wronged, once it has been caught at it. And Cecilia Lowell, who had walked into that room 10 years ago, an unknown nobody, and been torn to pieces, walked out of it that night, the most talked of, most admired, most courted woman in England, the wronged innocent, vindicated, magnificent, on the arm of an earl who adored her. But she did not, I am glad to tell you, care 2 pins for any of that. The admiration of the crowd that had ruined her was worth exactly nothing to Cecilia Lowell, and she knew it, and she let it wash over her without it touching her at all. For she had not come back for the crowd's good opinion. She had come back for the girl. And somewhere in the middle of that strange, triumphant evening, the Earl of Wyndham drew her aside, out onto the very terrace beyond the conservatory, near the little blue saloon where the whole cruelty had been done 10 years before, and he found her standing there, looking back through the glass at the bright room, with tears on her face at last, now that the worst was over. "Are you all right?" he asked her. "I think," she said slowly, "that I came back for her tonight. The girl I was, the one they killed in that room. I have been so angry at her, all these years, for being so trusting, so easy to destroy. I have been ashamed of her." She wiped her eyes. "And I find, now it is done, that I am not ashamed of her at all. She did nothing wrong. She was only kind and trusting, and went to help a cousin she thought was ill. There was never anything wrong with her. The wrong was all theirs." She turned to him, and the tears were falling, but she was, underneath them, more whole than she had been in 10 years. "You gave me that back. Not my name. I could have lived without my name. I had learned to. You gave me back the right to stop being ashamed of her, of myself. I did not know, until tonight, how heavy that shame had been, until you helped me set it down." And Alexander Frayne, Earl of Wyndham, who had carried his own 10 years of shame for having failed to save her, looked at the woman he had loved since he was a powerless boy of 24, and found that her words had set down a weight in him as well. "We have both been carrying it," he said, "your shame and my failure. 10 years apiece, I think." And here the great Earl's voice was not steady at all. "I think we might set them both down now, together, and not pick them up again. I love you, Cecilia. I loved the girl in the dance, and I love the woman who built a life out of the ashes and walked back into that room tonight, on her own 2 feet, and took back what was hers. Marry me. Not so that I can save you. You have shown the whole of England tonight that you need no saving. Marry me, because I have been 10 years incomplete without you, and I should like to spend the next 10, and the 10 after that, being complete. He smiled, unsteadily. Be the lady of this house in truth. The girl was ruined in it. Let the woman be its mistress, and fill it, every spring, with a ball that no one is ever ruined at again. And Cecilia Lowell, who had walked back into the worst room of her life and reclaimed herself from it, and stood now whole on the far side of 10 years of exile, laughed through her tears, and took the face of the man who had never forgotten her between her 2 hands, and said, "Yes. Oh, you patient, stubborn, faithful man. Yes." And that, my dear listeners, is where I leave them. On a terrace beyond a bright ballroom, a wronged woman made whole, and the man who never forgot her, with 10 years of shame and failure, set down at last between them and the rest of their lives, stretching out, for once, in their favor. They were married before the summer, and the Earl of Wyndham made Cecilia Lowell the mistress of Wyndham Court. And the following spring, when the great annual Wyndham Ball came round again, she stood at the top of that same staircase as its hostess, and looked down at the bright room where she had once been destroyed, now hers, entirely hers, filled with light and music and her own chosen guests. And not one soul was ruined in it that night, nor any night after, for as long as she was its lady. She made it, in time, a different sort of room altogether, known through all of society as the one great house where the overlooked were noticed, and the unfashionable were kind to, and the poor girl shining in a made-over gown was sought out and made welcome, rather than torn down. For the new Countess of Wyndham had a particular and unforgetting eye for the nobody at the edge of the room, having been that nobody once herself, and knowing to her bones what one kind face, one true defender, can be worth on the worst night of a life. If you ask me what this story is truly about, I will tell you it is about the difference between 2 men in a ballroom, the one who saw a chance to destroy a defenseless girl for sport, and the one who saw an innocent wronged and could not, though it cost him 10 years and very nearly his peace, ever let it go. The world is full of both kinds, my dears, in every bright room there is. And it is about a braver thing still, about a woman who was not content to be rescued, who would not let even the man who loved her simply hand her old life back like a returned glove, but who squared her own shoulders and walked back into the worst room of her life, and took back, with her own voice and her own 2 feet, the self that had been stolen from her. For there is all the difference in the world between being saved and being restored to yourself. And Cecilia Lowell, who could have had the first, insisted upon the second, and was right to. You have sat by my fire through a ruin, and a 10-year exile, and a return that turned a whole ballroom on its head, and I will not pretend I could have told it without you, at the other end of the line. If it has given you something tonight, a warmth, a fierceness, a quiet certainty that no one is finished who refuses to stay down, then I would ask you, before you go, to subscribe to Moonlight at Mayfair, for there are a great many more of these, and every one has a heart, and I should hate for you to miss a single one. It costs you nothing, and it means more to me than I can say from this side of the fire. And if you still will not, well, you know what I am going to say. You owe me one. You have owed me since the doors opened at the top of that stair. I am patient, and I never forget a debt. Subscribe to Moonlight at Mayfair, and come back to me beneath the soft light of the evening star, where every love is hard won, and every ending is deserved.